Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will add my compliments to your girls. Girls, senators have a hard time sitting still through these hearings, so you're doing really, really well. Thank you. And Dr. Gottlieb, I appreciated the visit we had in my office as well. I just do want to go on the record echoing the concerns that many of my colleagues have raised about the issue of conflict of interest. To Senator Whitehouse's point, you're following the rules, that's good, but you have extensive ties to the drug and biotech industry, and if confirmed, you're going to be tasked with regulating the same companies. I know you take the issue of personal integrity very seriously. I appreciate that. I will just say that part of this issue is about self-awareness and perspective and who you identify with. So if you are confirmed, I hope you will take that to heart as well. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the issue of opioids. As you know, we spoke about it in my office, and New Hampshire is one of the states which has just been devastated. We had about 500 deaths in New Hampshire in the last year. 70% of those deaths involved the drug fentanyl, which is becoming even more of an issue around the country. At a hearing that the FDA was at before this committee a few weeks ago, I asked about what are known as abuse deterrent formulations, and you referred to them a little while ago in one of your exchanges. The opioids in the abuse deterrent formulations are just as addictive as they are in other products without the so-called abuse deterrent properties. Experts have done surveys that show that 46% of primary care providers think that these abuse deterrent products are less addictive than other opioids. And that statistic is very high, but it doesn't surprise me because I can see how the term abuse deterrent could be confusing or misleading in this regard. And what we're learning is that the opioid issue may be packaged in a way that makes it hard to use in a traditional way for somebody suffering with addiction, but they just find a different way to use it. And so do you think the FDA has a role to play here in ensuring that there's a common understanding among providers that products called abuse deterrents are just as addictive as other opioids and are not abuse-proof because they can still be abused easily by, for example, just swallowing them?
Right. I echo your sentiments in many regards, Senator. I think, and I appreciate the question. I think the primary impediment to these abuse deterrent formulations becoming abused is that they're expensive right now, and once they go generic and become cheap, they're just as easy to abuse if you just take more of them.
Right.
I think what we're talking about is drugs that are harder to divert or tamper with in ways that might make them more attractive, abusable items. But I think the underlying issue that you surface as to whether or not we have the right nomenclature to describe these drugs and whether or not that the nomenclature that we're using in how we describe these drugs is conveying the right message not only to patients but in particular to providers is a reasonable question. And I think within the scope of what I want to do to try to push the agency around looking at a different framework for how we address this problem, I would include that question. You and I talked about it. I saw the press release that went out from one of the groups, and when I read it, it struck me as a reasonable question to be asking, and I want to ask that question.
Well, thank you. One of the other tools that we know we can use to combat this public health crisis, and one of the ones that you have at the FDA, the FDA has at its disposal, is the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, otherwise known as REMS, which the agency uses to try to stem the risks associated with certain medications. As you know, that includes things like prescriber training. You've been public in the past about your opposition to REMS, saying that they put burdens on providers. Because we are in the middle of a public health crisis, as you've acknowledged with this addiction epidemic, and because I know that many providers in my state welcome guidance from the FDA or anybody else who has the expertise about how to curb this public health crisis, do you think physicians should be able to look to the FDA for guidance about how to prescribe drugs like opioids?
I do, Senator. The article you referenced, which was a health affairs article, I think in 2007, 10 years ago, I think spoke to a different issue, which was the use of REMS to start to address drugs where there was a known risk and FDA wanted to attenuate the off-label prescribing of the drugs across the range of purposes for which a physician might want to use a drug under his discretion. Very different than this issue. I actually affirmed in that article, I think I largely affirmed the historical context in which the REMS had been used, which included the use of trying to prevent diversion and abuse of opioid drugs. That had been the historical use of REMS, and in fact, the early genesis of REMS under a different name, it wasn't called REMS back then, was created under Subpart H for the purpose largely of trying to address the opioid problem back at FDA. So I do fully support the use of that tool in this context. And in fact, I support the use of the tool across a lot of contexts. I think in many respects, the agency has gone on to use the program in ways that are far more judicious than what I was initially worried about when I wrote that article.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I see I am over time. I will submit for the record a question about some women's health issues because I am concerned about your involvement in what I thought, and many thought, was a politically motivated delay of the emergency contraceptive Plan B when you were at the FDA. So I'll submit that in writing, and thank you.
Thank you, Senator.